Hello, and thanks for tuning in to All Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. For this episode, we're going to focus on a research manuscript titled, Who Visits U.S. National Parks and Who Doesn't? A national study of perceived constraints and vacation preferences across diverse populations. This study was conducted by our three guests, who are Dr. Xiao Xiao, Dr. KangJae Jerry Lee, and Dr. Larson. The study is important because it objectively revealed that National Park Service units are not visited frequently by a large percentage of the American public, which underscores the need for the National Park Service to enhance relevancy and diversity by providing attractive and accessible recreation opportunities for historically marginalized groups. Before we discuss this research, let's have each researcher introduce themselves, and let's first go with Dr. Xiao, then Dr. Lee, and then Dr. Larson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Xiao Xiao, and I'm an assistant professor in School of Community Resources and Development at Arizona State University, located in Haikou, Hainan Province in China, and primarily conducting research and teaching activities in the International Joint Tourism Program. And my research interests include social justice issues in parks and protected areas, climate adaptation planning for cultural resources, and transportation planning in national parks. And it is my great pleasure to share this research findings with you guys in All Bodies Outside.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am KangJae Lee. I go by Jerry. I am an assistant professor in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management at NC State University. I am a social justice researcher focusing on park visitations, outdoor recreation participation, and subjective well-being. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for joining.
Hi, everyone. I'm Larson. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Parks, Recreation, Tourism Management at North Carolina State University. I'm a conservation social scientist whose research focuses on understanding and promoting positive interactions between humans and nature.
All right. Well, we got a fantastic group of researchers with us today. So why don't we jump into your study that I mentioned, and why don't we kick off the conversation with talking about why was this research relevant?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in to begin with. When we think about America's national parks, the iconic national parks that many of us put on a pedestal, we think about, we dream about all the time. This was a revolutionary idea in the early 1900s to create these spaces for the benefit and enjoyment of the people and to preserve natural resources for everyone. It's a very noble mission, the democratization of the outdoors. And for 100 years, parks have strived and struggled to achieve this mission. And although today we see 300 million or more people every year visiting national parks, one thing that we've noticed is that it's a very homogenous group of residents, of people in the United States who are coming. And they tend to be white, they tend to be higher income, and this is very concerning for an agency whose mission is to serve everyone. And that was kind of the impetus of inspiration for this research project.
All right, great. So was there anything else that wanted to be added to the relevancy of that, or should we kind of get into the background with the literature and what the literature says about this topic?
I mean, if you look at the demographic... Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
No. I think we can do that simultaneously. I think the literature review, provides some context of why this study was needed and why this is important.
Okay, sounds good. And Lincoln, what were you going to say there?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the demographic composition of our country here in the United States and how it's changing, and you look at park visitation and how it's really not changing to reflect that demographic change, I think in terms of relevancy, if we're trying to serve all people, that's the ultimate question, is how are we doing that effectively, or are we? And that's where this research idea really emerged.
Yeah, it seems like there needs to be some signaling done that's not being done currently by National Park Service to get those marginalized populations to visit. And so why don't we kind of get into the background on what the literature says. And so my first question is going to be, first off, let's just establish what is known about the visitation patterns at National Park Service sites. I know Lincoln touched on that a little bit, but why don't we go a little bit more in depth on that?
Yeah, sure. I can explain that a little bit. So there have been a lot of research. There are a lot of researchers focusing on this topic. Who is visiting national parks? One of the oldest study was actually conducted in 1950s. So it's more than like 50 years ago, right? There's a report called A Survey of the Public Concerning the National Parks. This was a report produced by the company called Audience Research. And this report documents that majority of U.S. national park visitors are predominantly white American, people who tended to have high income level and tended to have high education. So those are the three sort of main findings established in very old study on national park visitation. The follow-up studies usually show the same patterns. It's usually national park visitors are, well-educated, high-income, white individuals. So that has been sort of overarching themes when it comes to national park visitation. Now, the reason why we wanted to conduct an additional study was that a lot of people focusing on national park visitors by conducting surveys or focusing on specific park unit, but we don't really know. We didn't have so much discussions or research focusing on, okay, people are going to national parks, but what about the others, people who don't go to national parks, and where do they go? So this data set, when we are conducting this study, available at the time, was the most recent data concerning American public's preference and visitation to national parks, and it also provides that information. So we decided to look at who are these people who don't go to national parks, but where they're going. So I think that was the strength of this research.
Yeah, Jerry, that was fantastic. I think that's a great strength of the research to understand the people that are not visiting, where do they prefer to go to? I think that tells a lot about what the National Park Service can do in the future to attract those visitors so they can have all the great benefits that go along with visiting a National Park Service site. So my next question is, with conducting research, there's always some theoretical background. So what's the theoretical background regarding constraints to visiting National Park Service sites? I know that that's kind of there's some dense material about constraints with marginalized populations and whatnot. So if we can kind of go over that so the audience understands that.
Yeah, sure. Me again. I can take that. So the theoretical framework for this study is leisure constraint. The theory of leisure constraint for non-academic audience, this is basically the theory that describes some of the barriers that we experience when we try to engage in leisure recreation activities. So we apply the theory and try to understand, theoretically explain what are the reasons that people don't go to national parks or some of the barriers that they experience when they try to visit a national park. And the theory entails three large categories, sort of main categories of leisure constraints. One is intrapersonal constraint. This is about one's ability. This is very individualistic factors such as one's skill level, knowledge, and perhaps psychological factors too, fear about certain issues. Some people don't like to go to outdoor recreation activities because they are afraid of, wild animals or bugs or snakes or things like that. So those are the pretty much fear factors, psychological factors. So that's intrapersonal constraint. The second category is interpersonal constraint. This is more like interactions with other people. So, for example, if you go to some place and sometimes you feel out of place, or your interaction with somebody was not that pleasant. So those type of negative experience through the interactions with other can, negatively impact one's preference and participation in certain leisure activity. And the third category is a structural constraint. This is more like outside environment. So the term structural suggests that this is environmental factors, right? So access to a certain place, national park in this case, a lot of national parks, usually the crown jewels, national parks are in pretty remote area. So you have to drive a long distance. You have to sometimes take an airplane. You have to drive a long distance. So those are the distance factors, the environmental factors. And so they can fall into structural constraint category. So using this sort of three major ways to understand the barriers that people visit national parks. We use that as a theoretical framework and analyze the data set.
Yeah, and that sounds like that. Oh, go for it, Lincoln.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and add, and these theories have been applied to many forms of outdoor recreation, not just national park use. But because national parks, as Jerry was saying, are often harder to access in more remote areas and tend to magnify some of the pre-existing constraints, there's reason to believe that some of these things might be even more significant barriers for individuals trying to get to places like national parks, whether it's for personal reasons, whether it's for those interpersonal reasons, or just kind of the structural and logistical stuff that makes it difficult.
Yeah, and it seems like all those things that you just mentioned, Lincoln, kind of have a compounding effect too. So, you throw in the socioeconomic aspects, you throw in the sociocultural aspects, and people might start thinking, their perceived accessibility is very low, and so they're not going to want to go there. And so those constraints definitely need to be overcome and whatnot. And so I think that's really important to understand, kind of where we're starting with this research. So thanks for those explanations. I really appreciate it.
And some have even advocated for a higher level of constraint or cultural constraint, as you said, that kind of combines some of these things, the intersectionality piece, and makes it even more difficult for certain populations to access these resources. And that, again, was one of the main things we were thinking about here is across different cultural boundaries, are we seeing certain groups having a harder time experiencing these places than others?
Yeah, thanks for that note.
Yeah, Brian, I think you are spot on about this compounding impact of leisure constraints, and our research also documents that effect, and so we can discuss more when we cover the discussion section.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Jerry. Okay, well, fantastic. Why don't we keep kind of trucking along with setting the foundation for your research here? And so one more question I have before we get into how you did the research, how you conducted the research is, since visiting a national park is typically a vacation preference, what is known about vacation preferences across what are vacation preferences based on socio-demographic factors?
I'm not sure if, Cheryl, you want to take this, or I can cover that.
So I think based on what we reviewed for this topic, I would say that kind of like the limited studies has been exploring the impact of social demographics factors on the vacation preferences. Some of the existing studies has identified a few factors such as lifestyle patterns and travel distance, and travel informations and desirability of family members tends to be important factors that are associated with the vacation destinations. And also a few researchers has found that the elderly adults were more likely to travel to health-related or education-based tourism destinations compared to the younger populations. Besides so, I think there are a few studies has documented that compared to white Americans, African Americans tends to travel shorter distance and visit destinations associated with Black heritage. So that's, but overall, very limited studies has focused on examining the differences of vacation destinations by social demographic factors. And that's also, one of the driven factors that for this project, because we really need those informations about what are the preferences for the vacation destinations for people, those population groups who are not visiting national parks.
Yeah, thanks for the explanation, Xiao. And I think another thing that's really important too is to consider for vacation preferences, considering social connections. And I think that with our national parks, a lot of people have this kind of romantic viewpoint, or a romantic viewpoint is embedded in national parks that actually could be a barrier, where it's like, hey, you go to national parks for solitude and escape, but it doesn't incorporate those social connections that a lot of populations do seek out. And I think that's another important thing towards vacation preferences based on socio-demographic factors. Okay, so I think that kind of lays down the foundation of why your research is relevant and also the theoretical background. And so why don't we kind of hop into, first off, what were the major objectives of this study?
So there are three main research objectives. First, we want to finding out the characteristics of the social demographic information across different population groups of visitation to NPS sites, where we're defining the populations to three different groups as recent visitors, past visitors, and non-visitors. And I will explain how we're defining them, the criteria to defining them later when we are jump to the method part. But we also want to examine how the visitation status and the social demographic factors can collectively influence the constraints to national park site visitation, and also how them can collectively influence the vacation preferences. So that's our three main research questions for this research paper.
Okay, well, fantastic, Xiao. So you got those three major research questions. So why don't we talk about how did you go about conducting this research to answer those three research questions?
Yeah, so this research is based on a nationwide survey, which it's a comprehensive survey of American public. We call them as CSAP, and actually the CSAP survey has been conducted since 2000 for the first time, and this study is based on the second CSAP study, which was conducted from 2008 to 2009. And because the surveys, the aims of the survey want to cover the general population of U.S. general population, the U.S. So the survey used the random digital sampling method to collect the survey samples that living in all 15 states and districts of Columbia, and the survey used both landline survey and added some of the cell phone surveys to make sure that the spatial autocorrelations effect was reduced. So overall, the survey collected 4,103 samples and yielding a response rate of 12.5%. The demographic, the CSAP survey was also applying a weighting process so that the respondents' social demographic characters was aligned with the U.S. Census data, so that the sample could be representative. And as I mentioned, that we have in this study we have defining three types of NPS visitation status, including recent visitors, past visitors, and non-visitors. So the recent visitor was defined for the respondents who has reporting that they have visited a National Park Service unit within last 2 years and could successfully identify the name of the NPS unit that they have visited with the prompt that provided by the survey administrator. And the past visitors are those respondents who reported that they have visited at least one NPS unit during their lifetime, but the visit was not happening within last 2 years. And lastly, the non-visitors are those respondents who reporting that they have never visited any NPS unit during their lifetime. And from our basic descriptive statistics, we found that there are about 47% of recent visitors, 42% of past visitors, and 11% of non-visitors for the CSAP2 survey respondents. And we basically, for the data analysis part, we basically apply some of the statistical analysis, such as chi-square analysis, to compare the social demographic information across different social demographic groups and across different visitation groups, and also use the binary logistic regression to estimate what are some of the important variables that could influence the perceived constraints to visit national parks and the vacation preferences of destinations. So yeah, that's basically the method and data analysis approach for this paper.
Yeah, thank you, Xiao. That was wonderful. And I'm really excited about one piece your overall, I'm really excited about this study. One piece I'm really excited about is that you were able to track down non-visitors. And that's something that's always been really challenging to understand non-visitors in National Park Service sites, those that do not visit, to understand those preferences of why not and the socio-demographic factors. So I think that's something that's really great about this research. So why don't we start getting into the results? And first off, I was curious, so what were the demographic differences amongst these three visitor groups in your study?
Yeah, so the first of important findings is that we found that the visitation status are very different among racial ethnic groups, and Hispanic respondents and Black respondents are much more likely to be non-visitors comparing to white respondents. And we also found that respondents with higher education background were significantly more likely to be recent visitors, while those respondents with lower education background were significantly more likely to be non-visitors. And similarly, respondents with lower annual household income are significantly more likely to be non-visitors, comparing to those respondents who are having higher levels of annual household income. And we also found that the visitation status are very different among the populations with different age, where we found that younger populations were more likely to be non-visitors comparing to other age groups. So that's basically the very descriptive trends and characteristics regards to the three type groups of the visitation status for the CSAP2 survey data.
Okay,
and I'll jump in too. Yeah. And one of the things that struck me, in addition to just kind of the descriptive differences, was the magnitude of some of those differences. So, for example, among white respondents in the survey, 52% were recent National Park Service visitors. But if you looked at Black respondents or Hispanic Latinos, it was down to around 30%. So about half were in that recent visit category. And if you look at non-visitors, it's even more pronounced. Just 6% of white respondents had never been to a national park in the survey. But it was over a quarter, 4 times as many Hispanic, African-American respondents. So pretty dramatic differences. And for income, it's even more extreme. It's like 2% of the high-income group had never been, and 26% of the low-income group, 10 times more likely if you're in the low-income group to have never come. So it's not just the fact that there were differences, but there were dramatic differences that should be pretty eye-opening for anybody who cares about, managing these places as truly publicly accessible resources.
Yeah, well, thanks for the explanation, Xiao and Lincoln, on that. That's something that is definitely very dramatic, and that really shows that income, that relationship between income and visitation. There's a relationship there, and that's something that is part of that socioeconomic factor that we kind of discussed earlier on when we were setting the foundation for your study. So that's connects well with, it's so dramatic, and it connects well to the literature. So that was something that's really cool to see, or not cool to see, but connected to the literature.
Unfortunate, but interesting to document.
Okay, moving on to the next part of your results. And the next part of results were, what were the perceived constraints to visiting National Park Service sites?
Yeah, so the CSAP2 survey asked the barriers of the questions regards to the constraints to visit National Park Service units, and among the 13 the asked possible barriers to visit or constraints to visit national NPS units, the ones that respondents that are lack of the information of NPS units are the most salient constraints among them. And if we are looking at the perceived constraints among populations with different visitation status, we would see that recent visitors were less likely to agree with all constraints comparing to the non-visitors. And beyond the constraints of lacking of information about NPS units, some of the constraints that related to expense, for instance, the cost associated with lodging and food, are also identified as important constraints by non-visitors, and also like the transportation time to get into the National Park Service units has been identified as an important constraint to visit National Park Service units by non-visitors. So, but overall, the non-visitors are more likely to perceive almost every constraint comparing to the recent visitors. So that's basically the finding of the perceived constraints from the study.
Yeah, and I wonder, you focused, you touched a lot on lack of information. I wonder with that lack of information, like that's kind of a big piece. And I wonder if that has something to do with, does the information that National Park Service that they're delivering, does that information look diverse, or is it just all white people in their information? How are they going about signaling to diverse and marginalized populations that, hey, you are welcomed here too? And I wonder if that falls within that kind of just big lumping of lack of information. Maybe it's just, it's not being messaged in a way that is connecting to these marginalized populations.
Yeah, so based on some of it, from the CSAP survey, the questions was asked that whether they were not know much about National Park Service units, but from some of the other studies that I've done or engaged, is we have found that many traditionally marginalized groups are not aware that there were NPS units that are located within the accessible distance from their community, or the probably lack of the information that some of the areas or the units are managed by the National Park Service. So it's more it's kind of like the lack of the information about NPS stewardship. But also they were, from some of the other studies that I've engaged, that they expressed that they are lack of the information about how to get access to the NPS units that are existed within their or near their communities. So I guess that's are some of the places that National Park Service could do to enhance the diversities and engagement with the traditional marginalized group.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in a little bit. I think Xiao provided really good explanations of, why people are not aware of the National Park Service. And I think another way to look at it is that people tend to see what they want to see, psychologically speaking. So in other words, I just don't know much about National Park Service indicates that people who respond to this question is usually are not interested in outdoor recreation in general. So since they are not interested, they are not aware of the existence of research, right? So I think there will be, we have to look at conduct further research on this, but I think there's a significant correlations between the preferences and the lack of awareness.
Yeah, I agree on that, Jerry. I think that's definitely something that is going on. There is that correlation there. Also, Xiao, having information about how to access these sites. I know that some of these sites are in rural areas, and they might be difficult to kind of, navigate those rural areas and whatnot. And so information with that would certainly be helpful for populations to kind of just boost that visitation from marginalized populations.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, historically, national parks, certainly national parks, but even National Park Service units, monuments, historic sites, et cetera, really haven't been present in low-income, high-minority communities, which are a lot of the focal populations we're talking about here. And that has changed a bit recently with the urban agenda. There's certainly been a growing recognition of this problem and a growing desire and policy agenda to move parks closer to people who haven't historically enjoyed them. And I think that's a positive trend. But one of the more concerning things that I saw in this data, is Xiao was just pointing out too, is some of those other barriers for non-visitors. 3 or 4 times more likely to say things like this: I don't feel safe in parks. They're unpleasant places for me to be. Just putting parks near people that's not going to solve those problems. Right. And so there's another layer to this that I think is really important to kind of interrogate and dissect a little more as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of depth to it for sure. And, people's perceived safety in these places not being there, that's something that is significant and needs to be looked in further too. Okay, so moving on to the last bit of your results in this study, what types of vacation preferences were shown across visitor groups?
Yeah, so we asked, so during the CSAP2 survey asked the respondents whether they have take a vacation trip away from home for the past 2 years. And comparing to the non-visitors, the recent visitors reported very high rates of the vacation trips, where 93% of the recent visitors has taken vacation trips, compared to 76% of past visitors and 60% of non-visitors who are taking the out-of-town trips. And we also found that the recent visitors are more likely to prefer a trip to visit nature-based or historic-centered destinations, where non-visitors were more likely to prefer a trip to visit friends or relatives, or to attending an out-of-town sporting events, or visit casino or gaming places. So that's what are basically the biggest the differences that we have been found for the vacation destination differences among three types of the population groups. And we also found that the vacation preferences for destinations were different among different racial ethnic groups. Where Hispanic and Black respondents are more likely to visit the social center or the cultural oriented or social centered destinations, comparing to white respondents who are more likely to prefer nature-based destination for their vacation destinations. So that's basically the main findings for the vacation preferences from our study.
Yeah, Xiao, thanks for sharing that. And I think I'm glad that you touched on that social aspect. And I think, going back to something that we discussed earlier was, we have this kind of romanticized view of how national parks should be, and nature and escape and solitude. But social connections are such a great part of the experience. And, if you have great social connections in these natural areas, well, then you're going to have a better quality of experience, and, probably revisit after that and be someone that no longer is a non-visitor. And so I think that's something that's a really important finding is non-visitors are seeking social connections with friends and relatives. How do we foster that in national parks? How do we do that in national park units? And that might be something that helps get these marginalized populations to national parks so that they can have those benefits with visiting National Park Service units. Okay, well, that sounded great for the results. I appreciate all that explanation into the details of your study. And so now one of the best parts of doing research is the implications. How can this information be used to help out the National Park Service to get more diversity in terms of visitors? So what were the major implications of this study? Does anyone want to hop on that one?
Yeah, I can kick it off. There are a lot, and some of them are tricky to grapple with. I think that explains some of our hesitation.
I gotcha.
Certainly, it's what this study has done on a scale much larger than most is document these recurring constraints to national park visitation, the ones that Jerry just talked about earlier. And really illustrate that, particularly among non-visitors, a population that hasn't been studied to the same extent that park visitors have been studied, the constraints are even more prominent, perhaps, than we thought they would be. And that is a concern, especially when you talk about things like some of the structural constraints and even potentially cultural constraints that are preventing people from visiting these spaces. That wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was concerning. The other thing I'll add before others can jump in too, with respect to the vacation preferences portion of the results, is that what we found in large part is that a lot of these populations, especially African Americans, Hispanic, Latino populations, visiting outdoor spaces wasn't necessarily what they wanted to do. And so this creates somewhat of a conundrum for National Park Service managers, right? Because if you want to become more relevant, you either have to change what you're managing and offering to make it more appealing to people, or I guess the other alternative is say, we're not a theme park, obviously. We're not a spa or resort. We're not providing necessarily these services. So people are making a personal choice not to visit. And there's some things they can do on the cultural side, the social side. There's some things the Park Service can do. But if you make that choice, are you then intentionally excluding a large proportion of the population that you're supposed to be serving as part of your mission? And that's a really interesting and complicated question about mission creep and the future of parks and how we put all those pieces together. And to me, that's really interesting.
Yeah, super interesting and super complicated. So definitely, without a doubt. Jerry, were you going to add something on some of that?
Well, I agree with Lincoln. It's a challenging finding to a certain extent for National Park Service to do, how to balance the different needs or maybe preferences, right? We have traditional sort of visitors who really like to visit national parks, and those individuals tend to be, well-educated white individuals who like to explore natural environment. On the other hand, we have another group of individuals. If we, objectifies this population group, in another end of the spectrum is individuals who like to go to established sort of facilities or indoor type of outdoor recreation, such as, just like Lincoln mentioned, theme parks, cruise, casino, and things like that. How much does National Park Service need to accommodate that needs? To me, this is completely opposite to the mission of national parks to preserve the beauty of nature for the next generation and the current generations, right? So where is the balance? Where is the good point to strike the balance? It's a very, very challenging topic to discuss, I think. And one additional, comment that I would like to make is that we don't know much about, we need more research on the people of color that don't go to National Park Service. And the reason why this is because this data set has certain limitation, and it involves a lot of NPS units that are in the urban context. So is it really distance or income level, or is it cultural factors? I think there needs to be a lot of more research, follow-up research needs to be conducted to truly sort of unpack these complexities associated with some of the experience or maybe the hesitation that the people of color have in terms of visiting national parks.
Yeah, Jerry, I think that's, something that's really needed with, especially these non-visiting marginalized populations. And then one of the things within these populations too, that we should all remember is there's a lot of nuances and heterogeneity too, different perspectives, different preferences and whatnot. And that is also just another reason to, open up that research there for future research to get into those complexities, to understand those nuances
Absolutely.
within these populations. And that would just, more so inform it and also maybe see to what degree the National Park Service can accommodate some of those preferences. Cause some of this stuff goes against their mission. That's, they're not going to be opening a casino on the land or, stuff like that. But, I think understanding those nuances, more information, the better to help National Park Service be more welcoming towards those marginalized populations.
And I also want to add that to echo with Jerry and Lincoln's perspective about the relevancy and the preferences for the for the trips to visit National Park Service, since that really the awareness of National Park Service's stewardship is kind of like serving as a major perceived conscience that the National Park Service has commissioned the third CSAP survey to ask the respondents about their awareness of their different initiatives, such as the initiatives of education programs and cultural programs and recreation programs. and to explore whether they have been aware or used the online content to learn about historical places and natural resources, and and also like one of and also whether they have aware that MPS visit to engage with the community's conversation about park issues. So I think those are all of those are promising pathways to enhance the relevancy and awareness of MPS stewardship with diverse population and traditionally marginalized groups. And also there are a lot of the infos that we need to dig more to understand why there are some reason that some groups are not really visit national parks more often. And how to make them more engaged with the MPS stewardship.
And Brian, your original question you posed related to the relevancy of the research and kind of the relevancy of parks in general. And I think community outreach is a centerpiece of relevancy, understanding, listening, and connecting. And that's something historically the National Park Service hasn't been good at. They're managing kind of pristine vignettes of the past. But if you want to engage with contemporary society, you have to be there and you have to interact with people and you have to maintain a presence that resonates with those different populations. And we see some positive trends in that direction from the Park Service and other park agencies, but there's still a lot of room for growth. And I think this research really illustrates that potential, and we start thinking about different ways we might accomplish that.
Yeah, Jerry, are you going to go for it?
Yeah. I think Xiao made a really good point that NPS is trying to change this pattern. Right, the visitation pattern that has been going for more than decades. And I think the agency is making a lot of effort in terms of outreach programs and, advertising materials and different ways to, culturally more relevant to diverse group of Americans. And with that, I think National Park Service can do more. When it comes to historical background of National Park Service, we have to admit that this, preservations of nature, this is heavily centered on white European Americans' perspective and National Park Service. A lot of crown jewels of national parks are created upon the land that the indigenous people used to occupy, right? So acknowledging that history, admitting that history of sort of military conquest involved in the creation of national parks and fairly communicating that history, I think National Park Service can, they're doing it, but I think they can do better.
Yeah, Jerry, thanks for that. And it seems like there's certainly a number of things the National Park Service can do that are low cost, low resource, that signal to these marginalized populations that, they are welcome there. And I think, Jerry, you just touched on that really nicely. But then there are some things that maybe the National Park Service is not within their mission to do as well. But there certainly seems like there's some low cost, low resource signaling that they could do to help with getting marginalized populations into National Park Service units. And so this has been a really great conversation about what, kind of some further steps for future research. And so just kind of as we're concluding, going over your study, was there any other tidbits of future research that any of you wanted to touch on that should be looked at in the future? Okay, I think we got it all then. All right. Well, yeah, go for it, Jerry.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a research implication or practical implication. I think one way that we have to be mindful is that when we do this type of issues related to outdoor recreations, one thing that I really want to be circumspect of is this idea of white savior complex, right? It's because what I mean by this is that this outdoor recreation activities, the creation of national parks, a lot of these space is centered on a white Americans perspective, European Americans perspective, right? So, yeah, promoting visitation from people of color, that's great because nature provides a lot of benefits. But at the same time, we shouldn't imposing the activities to them and saying that this is what you need to do. That's basically white saviors approach that, let me tell you what's good for you. Right, you have to visit national parks. No, I think we need to be cognizant of, be careful about how we approach this matter and how we reach out to the people of color who have been oppressed and marginalized because of the creation of national park. So I think it's something that we have to be very carefully approach.
And if you look at some of the greatest barriers to change, are often internal. I do a lot of research with state wildlife agencies as well, and they're worried about the same types of issues, diversity, equity, inclusion related issues. And yet 80-90% of the employees at these places are white Americans, mostly men who, it's not necessarily even their fault, just their cultural background experiences don't enable them to see the bigger picture. And I think what I'd like to see is more research, perhaps internally to the agency and the organizations themselves, to understand what some of those barriers, intrinsic barriers, might be to the growth that Jerry just talked about, and then how some of those things can be overcome. Because yes, external pressure and change is going to help, but we also have to look within ourselves and acknowledge some of our own limitations in thinking and our own values in order to progress in a way that allows and opens the doors for more people to experience the places that we love.
Yeah, I think seeing, reflecting on our bias, our self-biases and assumptions would help us, approach this strategies and tactics sensitively and with empathy. And that is something, kind of just talking about what, especially what Jerry made there with his point. I think that sensitivity and empathy is needed, and that needs to be created through what you just mentioned, Lincoln, having that understanding, what's going on intrinsically with people, to understand their preferences, whatnot, biases and assumptions. Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, everyone, this was a very fantastic conversation. I really appreciate y'all tuning into All Bodies Outside, talking about the details of your study. And it's something that is a very impactful study. And it was wonderful to get all of you on here at once. So I want to say thank you very much for being willing to come onto a podcast. I know I sent a cold email out to all of you saying, hey, you want to come on this podcast? And you're like, what the heck? Like, what's this podcast? So I appreciate you all being willing to come onto my podcast and discuss your research. And it's very meaningful. And I think it paves a good step forward for future research too, to get into some of these nuances that we discussed today. Okay, well, I'm going to throw on the outro music and we'll call it a episode.
Thanks for having us all at once, Brian.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.